The story begins one beautiful day in Kolendijk, capital city of Bonaire. A young tourist named Judy had just called on Governor Hessling, a gentleman from Old Holland, who governed the island with dignity and an old-world courtesy that was, especially to the visitor, charming and altogether in keeping with the setting. Bonaire lies at the southernmost rim of the Caribbean Sea, just 35 miles from Venezuela, and within minutes by air from her sister islands, Aruba and Curacao. When Napoleon was emperor, they installed the cannon on the fort. 200 years before that, the Spanish were just discovering Bonaire. And midway and on into the 19th century, Bonaire was transfer grounds for slaves from Africa. Many's the exiled prisoner who's languished amid this pile of stone. And Simon Bolivar, the liberator, once sent a letter that bears evidence of having been sent from this old post office. Papiamento is the language here, as in Aruba and Curacao, but Dutch is the official language. Neither indigent nor backward, the people of Bonaire are instead industrious and self-sustaining, living for the greater part on the sea. The salt, as we shall see, still remaining an important factor in their lives. Because the island is, for the most part, arid, most fresh vegetables and fruits come from nearby Venezuela. Judy had no time to spare, for everyone hurries in Bonaire. The streets of Kolendijk teemed with traffic. She weaved in and out among the populace, and emerging from the shadows of one of the government rest houses, faced the main street, where miraculously enough she emerged unscathed, though the automobiles roared at her from every direction.
Mr. Narrator, that's a different picture you're thinking about, remember? This is Bonaire, a truly sleepy and peaceful place where no one rushes, no one hurries, and everything is really tranquil. Why, it's so peaceful, I've been thinking of buying property down here and resting between pictures.
Aren't you afraid that may be a long time? No comment, eh? Well, you're right at that. But I noticed that you did give up in despair at finding anyone about...
Did you know that there are 3 women on Bonaire to every man?
Well, that accounts for your temerity.
Did you know that Bonaire is extremely healthy?
Did you know that this sequence has ended? Framed under the omnipresent Dibby tree, the road to Land's End winds along the Emerald Sea.
My appointment with the governor was a most pleasant experience. We drove south past Vliegveld, on toward Punt Weerkant, Blauwepan, Wietepan, and past Rodepan, with a final destination at Lacropunt.
Hey, where'd you learn all them names?
Those names, silly. Learn them? Why, I didn't. It comes naturally. My grandmother on my father's side was Dutch, or didn't you know?
Well, I knew there was something.
The flamingo colony is one of the last on Earth, and every year thousands of these beautiful birds nest here and raise their young.
Long ago, the salt industry supported these venerable ruins of Blauwepan in grand style. But time has taken her toll, and now only the massive architecture remains. Now only the salt houses and management headquarters stand, fading remnants of a blustery past. From across the sea came gallant schooners with bucko mates to fill the holds with salt from Bonaire. But it was the hardy Dutch and their wonderful West Indies Company that decreed that the ABC Islands should furnish the salt they so sorely needed in the old country.
I tasted the salt. It was too strong for my taste, but Governor Hessling told me that refining would change all that. We walked on past ancient pylons that marked the anchorage the salt ships would find. We walked on down to the old slave cabins, and I saw the tiny huts the slaves occupied until they were freed in 1869.
On the shores of the lake, the sea foam gathers in windrows, piling on the shingle beach like an edible meringue. Native lore has it that this foam is poisonous. This is the shore of Pikkelmeer, a shallow lake that stretches for miles along the southwest of the island. Only a narrow strip of land separates it from the sea, and the waters of the lake, tinged with cerise and lavender, are an unforgettable sight. At Wietepan stand the salt houses that shelter the product. Sometimes workmen come with their little barrows to harvest a load of salt, But today, the industry falters, and only a tiny portion of the salt that is harvested finds a market. For other salt mines throughout the world have been developed, and Bonaire's ancient industry will soon fade into memory.
It was fascinating to see these native boys with their bare feet trudging down the pathways to the salt ponds. Where once thousands of slaves toiled in a great industry, now only ruins mark their passing. On a distant sand knoll lies a huge pile of salt, ready for the schooners that rarely come, while hard by is the old horse barn where Dobbin, long since gone from the island, rested when his day's work was done.
It's hard work wheeling a barrow across the tiny walks that crisscross the salt flats. The trade winds blow constantly, and the heat shimmers, and the salt brine stings the feet and dries the skin. The pay is necessarily skimpy, and its very meagerness is reason enough for the diminishing industry. Shovels are part of the tools of the trade, and a strong back and stronger heart are part and parcel of the job.
The sea is the constant supplier here, for when the tidal flats are opened to admit the seawater, it courses over the salt pans and deposits its brine. Then the sun begins its work, and evaporation takes place, and when the weeks have passed, and only when the salt lies exposed, can the harvest begin. There are always dried pans waiting to shovel, while others are inundated and processing.
But manpower is the factor that determines the output. And so, without modern propellants and machinery, the industry lags, and will someday die, for it's not in Bonaire's destiny to really revive the industry that made her important in the almost forgotten past. And when our three gallants had deposited their loads at the crystallized pile that stood by the sea, when they had added their might to the salt stored in the open, they had had a full day of toil, for nowadays no one would consider constant labor on the ponds. It was only by sheerest good fortune that we found this small group of workmen on the job, for sometimes weeks go by without a grain of salt being gathered.
In eons past, Mother Earth pushed Bonaire up from the sea. Wild waves crash on the windward side. From the tip of the island, the lighthouse looks out on a scene, splendid and altogether romantic and charming.
African superstition and Carib Indian superstition have long since disappeared under the onslaught of the unemotional Dutch and the influence of the Catholic Church. But on Bonaire, as nowhere else in the Leeward Islands, there survives a masquerade ceremony that follows a bountiful harvest. It is called Simadam and has strong Catholic connotations, coming as it does on a Christian holiday. The people make their own masks and play their guitars, rendering, on the whole, music they themselves have composed, for they are poetic, musical, and always romantic.
I spent a whole week on Bonaire. I swam, I fished, and I traveled from one end to the other. Then we sailed around the island. Some friends had a small fishing schooner, and they loaned the ship and her crew to me. It was tremendous fun. Everyone is unspoiled and happy, and the grinning boys had many a laugh over their newfound landlubber. But somehow I learned to clew up the topsail, take a reef in the mainsail, and bait the hooks. And when it came time to leave, I was a dyed-in-the-wool Bonairite. So next time I have time out, it's Bonaire for me. I'll grab a Grace liner, travel on down to Aruba or Curacao, and catch a ship for the neatest little hideaway in all the blue Caribbean.